We continue our message on Noah, a godly person. And we have the scriptures. I have them printed in the bulletin if you had one. Starting in Genesis 6, 8, 9, and then 22, and then verse 7, chapter 7, verse 5, which we'll talk about on the 5th, which will be the last part of this message. What are the characteristics of a godly person? And we see these in Noah. Genesis 6, verse 8, but Noah found grace in the eyes of the Lord. These are the generations of Noah. Noah was a just man and perfect in his generations, and Noah walked with God. Thus did Noah according to all that God commanded him, so did he. And then chapter 7, verse 5, and Noah did according unto all that the Lord commanded him. So in part 1, we looked at the first characteristics of a godly person, and that was that they had experienced the grace of God, and the grace of God was upon them. Noah found grace in the eyes of the Lord. And we looked at the Strong's definition. I forget his first name, but Strong's dictionary or Strong's concordance is a recognized source for accurate biblical interpretation of words. And he says that grace comes from the word charis, which means graciousness or gratifying of manner or act, abstract or concrete, literal, figurative, or spiritual. And I emphasized this last week, especially the divine influence upon the heart and its reflection in the life, including gratitude, acceptable benefit, favor, grace, and gift, joy, liberality, pleasure, thanking, and thankworthy. So it means all those things, of course, depending on the context. In 1 Corinthians 12, where Paul was listing the spiritual gift, the word there is charismata, or the grace gifts. When we say a person is charismatic, we're not talking about a denomination or anything, but they have an attractive personality which sort of draws people to them. And as we define grace, you may have your own definition, but generally preachers define it as God giving us what we don't deserve. We deserved alienation, but he gave us fellowship. We deserved condemnation, but he gave us forgiveness. We deserve his divine wrath, but he gave us his love. We deserve hell, but he gave us and gives us heaven. So the first evidence of a godly person was that they had found grace in the eyes of the Lord. Not simply saving grace, but living grace. Remember, that was one of the definition words, the divine influence of God upon the life of a person as evidenced by their behavior. And that's sort of my paraphrase. And of course, we understand that Noah and his family was not saved by believing in Jesus because Jesus had not come yet, but they worshiped the true living God. They didn't know anything about the Messiah, right? That hadn't come up in scriptures yet, but their focus was on the true and living God. So the second evidence of a godly person is found in Genesis 6, 9. These are the generations of Noah. Noah was a just man and perfect in his generations, and Noah walked with God. So the generations they're talking about are listed in Genesis 5:32, and Noah was 500 years old and begat Shem, Ham, and Japheth. And that's well, he was 500 years old when he begat the children, but also he was 500 years old when he started building the ark. And he was 600 years old when the ark was finished. And the ark, the world was flooded for a year and 50 days. So Noah was getting to be what we would consider a pretty ancient person, but in those days it wasn't that unusual. And as I toured the Creation Museum up in Kentucky, the explanation, I think I mentioned this last week, was that before the flood, the world was covered with a misty cloud, as it were, that kept the effects of the sun away from the body, and the earth was watered from underneath, not from rain. So it was, and one person described it as a terrarium, you know, a globe that you can plant plants in, and you don't have to water them because it's self-contained. It creates its own moisture. And then of course after the flood, it started raining and sun rays and all that kind of stuff. So people started living less and less and less. 2 Peter 2:5 says, "And he spared not the old world, but saved Noah and 8 persons, a preacher of righteousness, bringing in the flood upon the world of the ungodly." So this is my supposition, my imagery, if you would. Noah would hammer for a while, then he'd preach for a while. He'd hammer a while, he'd preach a while. I don't know, that's just something I look at. And surely as he was hammering and preaching, people thought he was crazy. Maybe he was drunk or just mentally incapacitated. In other words, he didn't have all his marbles because he was talking about something called rain, and they'd never, what's rain this preacher's talking about? I never heard of that. I think his sermon title, if he had a sermon title, would have been Faith or Flood. You choose. Hebrews 11:7 says, "By faith Noah, being warned of God of things not seen as yet, moved with fear, prepared an ark to the saving of his house, by the which he condemned the world and became heir of the righteousness which is by faith." So in this verse we find 3 distinctions of a godly person. That's Genesis 6:9. First of all, they're just. The Hebrew word there means lawful or righteous. He stood before God as a righteous man, not by his works or by his words, but because he believed God. And that's what Hebrews 11:7 said. He believed God, and so he built the ark, not knowing what was going to happen. I mean, he didn't know about rain either now. So this was all sort of, well, not sort of, it was totally by faith that he was building a boat. The world, I'm sure, called him a fanatic, but God called him a child of his. And only by honest and sincere motives can a person become a child of God and find grace in the eyes of the Lord. So he's not only just before God, but also before men. The word just means he was justified by God, of course, but also it means that there was no blame that could be put on him by people. I'll put it this way, no real true blame. I mean, we're accused as Christians of being bigots and homophobic and all that kind of thing. But that's false blame. It's not true blame. But before God, he was just. He was blameless before God. He was blameless before men. It implies he was honest when he dealt with people. The second distinction of a godly person is that they're perfect. Ooh. Is anybody here perfect? If so, raise your hand and I'll come see the scars. Okay, none of us are perfect, all right? And we understand in biblical terms, sometimes it means perfect, without flaw. God says, be ye perfect, or be ye holy, even as I am holy, which is perfect, without flaw. That's the standard that God set for us. I've used this illustration a couple of times. It's like when you raise children, you told them to never lie, probably. You didn't say, well, you can tell the truth 80% of the time and 20% of the time it's okay to lie. No. Your standard was no lying, 100% truth. That's where the bar was set for your child. That's the bar that God set for us to be holy, just like he is holy. We never attain that holiness here in this life, but he's not going to lower the bar so we can meet some kind of lower standard. We're not perfect. We're not sinless. We still make mistakes. Sometimes our motives are not perfect. As we spoke of in Sunday school. Did I mention Sunday school's at 10? Okay. Just want to make sure. All right. So we're perfect in the sense that when God looks at us, he does not see our sin, but he sees the blood of Christ which covers all sin. And Noah lived a life which was above accusations by his fellow humans. Philippians 2:14 and 15 speaks to all Christians. Do all things without murmurings and disputings, that you may be blameless and harmless, the sons of God without rebuke in the midst of a crooked and perverse nation, among whom you shine as lights in the world. Just a side note for what it's worth, blameless is used 5 times or 15 times in the New Testament. 5 times it refers to deacons and pastors. So Noah lived a blameless life in his generations. Usually a generations, as they count biblical generations, was 40 years. So Noah lived quite a few generations, yet he was blameless. Yeah, some of y'all have lived 2 generations according to the biblical use of 40 years. I'm approaching 2 generations. As we look back, what can we say our testimony is over the generations? Can it be said, as it was of Noah, that we have been found blameless? And notice that, of course, we know that Noah lived in a horribly wicked world, so wicked that God repented that he had made man. God was sorry he made man. Now, God doesn't change his emotions, all right? In other words, he wasn't glad he made man, now he's sorry he made. No, that's not what that means. It means in our understanding, God was sorry he made man because he destroyed them. But he was more sorry perfectly because of their sin that was so rampant upon the face of the earth. I was talking to someone a couple weeks ago that there was a young man really enthusiastic about the military. So he joined the military and went through the training and got to his first base, and he was really into the military. That's what he wanted to do. Well, they related to this person that the homosexual lifestyle was so prevalent where he was that he couldn't go to his commander, who was gay. So at his first opportunity, he got out of the military and is now an electrician, I believe, in Daphne. On Fox News, it was reported that a drag queen said that the traditional Christian marriage is out of date and needs to be discarded. There was a lady on Fox News also that I saw who, until COVID, didn't know what her child was being taught at school. But as the child was required to stay home and take online courses, she began to see what the child was being taught, and she totally disagreed with it. And when she voiced her opposition to what was being taught, I'm not sure how she used the word, but she used the word brave. And someone said, don't use that word, it's offensive to some people. Do you know a famous song that has the word brave in it? It's called the Star Spangled Banner, the home of the brave. I wonder if that's going to be changed to the home of the free and the tolerant. So it's ironic that people who say Christians aren't tolerant of Christianity. On every hand, they're trying to dispose of Christianity from our nation, and yes, even from the world. Again, I think it was this new news network, sort of like Fox, very conservative, and he was quoting some words that a person had said, that marriage was between a man and a woman. And he quoted it in several speeches that this person had made. And that person was Joe Biden, who signed into law the gay marriage. It made it a federal crime to not recognize gay marriages. And the person said, and this is what's sort of, I won't say scary, because God's in control, but tragic, is that, the president saying one thing and then later doing something else. But what he said is he put the federal government at war with the church, who only recognizes a marriage between a man and a woman. That's what our president has done for Christianity, who claims to be a Catholic. So, of course, we know, we're all old enough to remember when prayer was taken out of school. And off of public buildings and things like that. And we were talking in the back before service. It's not the unsaved people who we are to blame for that. I'm sorry, it's not. I wish we could. It's God's people that are to blame. Because God said, and this is 2 Chronicles 7:14, used to use in revivals, if my people, which are called by my name, shall humble themselves and pray and seek my face, then will I hear from heaven and answer their prayers and heal their land. So it falls back on Christians. The third distinction of a godly person is that they walk with God. The only other person in Scripture who walked with God, of course, was Enoch. One commentator listed 8 things which Enoch did to walk with God, but the writer of Hebrews sums it up in one word. This is out of Hebrews 11:5. By faith Enoch was translated that he should not see death, and was not found because God had translated him. But before his translation, he had this testimony, that he pleased God. What a testimony. Do we please God? I know we try. Noah walked with God. Not only was he honest, but he was devout. He acted with God. He was always as one under God's eye. He was always aware of God's seeing him, of his presence. And he lived with communion with God in a terribly wicked society at that time, as we live in this time. He was always willing to conform himself to God's will and not to the societal norms or expectations. Noah enjoyed sweet communion with God, which Adam and Eve enjoyed before their sin. He walked in the ways of truth and righteousness. He was ever conscious of being pleasing to God. So from these two messages, we've seen that the characteristics of a godly person are they have found grace, mercy, grace in the eyes of the Lord. They walk justly and honestly and blamelessly for men. Then if we read Genesis 7:5, we'll see what our next sermon is. Okay? So, have we received God's saving grace? I believe everyone here, in my heart, I believe everyone here has. Of course, that's between you and God, but from y'all's testimony, from y'all's love of God that I've seen in your lives, it's evident. So we receive the saving grace, but are we living by what I call living grace? You know, Paul said 3 times he asked God to remove the thorn from his side, and God said, no, no, you're going to have to live with this, Paul, but my grace is sufficient for living with this issue. Then are we just and honest in dealing with other people? Are we blameless before people? Now, there's critical people who are always going to point the finger and blame you for being hypocritical and believing in an ancient book that has no meaning today. Those slide off our back because we know they're unjustified critical judgments, false blames, have no substance to them, but we don't want to be blamed for intentionally harming someone, or either emotionally, especially not physically, or doing something that's going to weaken their spiritual maturity. So the invitation is, I don't know. I'm leaving that up to God. That's his part of the service, as all of it is now. But I can only get to the eaters. God has to take, through the Holy Spirit, his words, not my words, his words, because he speaks to everybody differently, because we all have different needs. And as he speaks to you, my invitation is simply to respond to him as he speaks to you. So let's just have a time of silent invitation as you let God deal with you and you deal with God in turn.